The history books will tell you the Cold War was a standoff, a long, uncomfortable peace between two superpowers who stared at each other across decades of ideological distance and chose, repeatedly, not to fire. That version of events is technically accurate. It is also profoundly misleading. What the textbooks tend to omit is the texture of that period, the procedural reality of it, the way entire governments operated under the assumption that civilization might end on any given Tuesday, not because a leader decided it, but because a sensor malfunctioned, or a satellite misread the sun, or a single officer in a bunker somewhere decided, against every protocol drilling into him, to trust his own judgment over the readout on his screen. The Cold War was not mostly peaceful. It was a condition of managed extinction-level risk, administered through bureaucratic channels, carried forward by institutional momentum, and survived largely through coincidence. That is not a dramatic interpretation. That is the documented record, much of which remained classified for decades, some of which is still being processed, and pieces of which governments on multiple continents would prefer never entered public circulation at all. There are facts from this period that, when stated plainly, do not sound like history. They sound like fiction. They sound like the kind of scenario a novelist would construct to illustrate the absurdity of nuclear deterrence, and then perhaps cut from the manuscript because no editor would believe a reader would accept them. But these events happened. They are documented in declassified files, in government archives, in the personal testimony of the people who were present, and in the slow, methodical work of researchers who spent careers prying these records out of the institutions that buried them. What follows is an account of 20 of those facts, not the most sensational, not the most obscure, the most structurally important, the ones that reveal something true about how the Cold War actually functioned, which is to say, how it actually almost ended everything. The first thing to understand is that the United States and the Soviet Union were not simply adversaries who chose to exercise restraint. They were two vast administrative organisms that had each constructed over decades elaborate systems designed to function without human judgment at the moment of maximum crisis. The logic was coherent in a certain narrow way. Human beings panic. Human beings make errors. Human beings can be deceived, incapacitated, or killed. If the decision to retaliate against a nuclear strike depended entirely on a human being being alive and coherent and in communication with their command structure at the exact moment retaliation needed to be authorized, then the deterrent was unreliable. So both sides built systems to solve that problem. And those systems, once built, developed their own logic, their own momentum, and their own capacity to produce outcomes that no human being had specifically chosen. The Soviet Union constructed something called the perimeter system. In the West, it is sometimes called dead hand, which is an informal name that nonetheless captures the essential character of the thing with uncomfortable precision. The system was designed to detect the signatures of a nuclear attack and, if certain conditions were met, automatically launch a retaliatory strike without requiring authorization from any surviving human authority. The specific triggering conditions were classified and remain only partially understood. What is known is that the system was real, that it was operational, that it monitored seismic activity and radiation levels and communication traffic, and that under certain circumstances it was capable of issuing launch commands to Soviet missile forces without a human being making that decision in real time. Soviet officials acknowledged the existence of perimeter in the 1990s. The system, by most credible accounts, remained operational after the Cold War ended. The infrastructure that was built to manage the possibility of human extinction did not simply disassemble itself because the political arrangement that created it changed. The systems persisted. The American approach to the same problem was different in its architecture but similar in its underlying logic. There existed within the American command structure a concept called pre-delegation, through which nuclear launch authority could be, and at various points was, extended downward through the chain of command to officers who were not the president and not even senior civilian officials. The specific arrangements varied over time and remain partially classified. But the documented record makes clear that during certain periods of the Cold War, the authority to initiate nuclear strikes was held by military commanders at levels of the hierarchy that most Americans, if they had been aware of this, would have found deeply uncomfortable. The system was not designed to be reckless. It was designed to ensure survivability of the deterrent. The consequence of that design was that the decision to end civilization as a functioning enterprise was, during certain periods, legally held by people whose names most Americans never knew. In November of 1983, NATO conducted a military exercise called Able Archer 83. The exercise was designed to simulate a coordinated nuclear release, practicing the procedures and protocols that would govern a transition from conventional to nuclear warfare. It was, from the Western perspective, a routine training event. The Soviet Union did not experience it that way. Soviet intelligence had been tracking what they believed to be indicators of an impending NATO first strike for years. The KGB had an active program called Ryan, which stood for Raketno-Yadernoye Napadanie, meaning nuclear missile attack, and it was specifically tasked with identifying early warning signs of Western preparations for a nuclear strike. By late 1983, Soviet intelligence was reporting those indicators: the heightened alert status of Western forces, the unusual communication patterns, the exercises that rehearsed nuclear procedures in unprecedented detail. When Able Archer began, certain elements of the Soviet military moved to a higher state of readiness. Nuclear-capable aircraft in Eastern Europe were placed on alert. For a period of days, the Soviet Union appears to have genuinely believed, or at minimum seriously entertained the possibility, that it was observing the final preparations for a Western nuclear attack. The exercise ended. The alert stood down. The people in Washington making decisions during those days did not know, in real time, how close the situation had come to a Soviet preemptive response. They found out later, through intelligence assessments that were themselves classified. A President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board report on the episode, produced in 1990, concluded that the Soviet reaction had been genuine, and that the United States had, without intending to, come closer to nuclear war than it had recognized at the time. That report was itself classified until 2015. A year before Able Archer, on September 26, 1983, a Soviet officer named Stanislav Petrov was the duty officer at Serpukhov 15, a secret Soviet nuclear early warning facility located south of Moscow. His job, in the event of a detected American missile launch, was to report that launch up the chain of command, triggering a response protocol. At 12:15 in the morning, his system reported an incoming American missile. Then it reported a second, then a third, fourth, and fifth. The protocol was clear. He was supposed to report a confirmed attack. He did not. Petrov looked at what his system was telling him and concluded that it was wrong. His reasoning was not technical in any sophisticated sense. It was, in his own later description, almost intuitive. The Americans, he reasoned, would not launch a nuclear first strike with 5 missiles. If they were going to start a war, they would launch everything. 5 missiles made no sense as an opening strike. He waited. He reported a system malfunction. He was correct. The system had misidentified sunlight reflecting off clouds as missile exhaust plumes. The Molniya early warning satellite had produced a false positive. If Petrov had followed protocol, if he had reported a confirmed attack to his superiors, the Soviet response system would have activated. What would have happened next is not fully knowable, but the systems on the Soviet side were designed to respond quickly before incoming missiles could destroy the retaliatory capability. Petrov's decision to distrust his equipment was the kind of decision the system was specifically not designed to depend on. He was later reprimanded for improperly filling out the logbook during the incident. He received no formal recognition of any kind from the Soviet military. He died in 2017. The file on his incident remained classified for years after the Cold War ended, and his story only became widely known because a researcher stumbled upon it in the mid-1990s while working on an unrelated project. The B-52 crash near Goldsboro, North Carolina, in January of 1961 involved the accidental release of 2 nuclear weapons over American soil. The aircraft experienced structural failure during flight, broke apart, and the 2 Mark 39 hydrogen bombs it was carrying fell to Earth. One of them, the one that came down in a field, behaved almost exactly as it would have had it been intentionally dropped. The parachute deployed, the triggering mechanisms engaged through most of their sequence. A safety report produced after the incident, which remained classified for decades and was only partially declassified following a Freedom of Information Act request in 2013, concluded that 3 of the 4 safety mechanisms on one of the bombs had failed. Only a single low-voltage switch had prevented detonation. The weapon had a yield of approximately 3 to 4 megatons, which is to say it was several hundred times more powerful than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The area that would have been affected by its detonation would have encompassed significant portions of multiple eastern states. The contamination would have been continental in scale. A Defense Department official named Robert McNamara, who was Secretary of Defense at the time, later stated publicly that it was only by the slimmest of margins that North Carolina was not destroyed. The government's public position at the time of the incident was that there had been no possibility of a nuclear detonation. The classified record said something different. The Cuban Missile Crisis is probably the most famous near catastrophe of the Cold War, but the version of it that entered popular history is incomplete in ways that matter. The standard account focuses on Kennedy and Khrushchev negotiating over 13 days in October 1962 while the world held its breath. What that account tends to omit is the number of times during those 13 days that events nearly escaped the control of both leaders entirely. On October 27, 1962, a day that is sometimes called Black Saturday by historians who have studied the crisis in detail, 3 separate incidents occurred that each had the potential to trigger a nuclear exchange. First, an American U-2 reconnaissance aircraft was shot down over Cuba by a Soviet surface-to-air missile. The decision to fire that missile was made by Soviet officers on the ground in Cuba, without explicit authorization from Moscow. Kennedy's military advisors informed him that under the rules of engagement he had previously authorized, the shooting down of an American aircraft over Cuba constituted grounds for a retaliatory airstrike. Kennedy did not immediately authorize that strike. He absorbed the information and continued negotiating. Second, on the same day, another American U-2 aircraft on a routine air sampling mission near Alaska accidentally strayed into Soviet airspace. Soviet interceptors were scrambled. American interceptors were also scrambled. The American interceptors were armed with nuclear-tipped air-to-air missiles, which were the standard weapons available to them at that time for engaging Soviet bomber formations. The aircraft returned to American airspace without an engagement occurring. Third, and this is the fact that took the longest to become publicly known, an American destroyer called the USS Beale was using depth charges to force a Soviet submarine to surface. The submarine, designated B-59, was running out of oxygen, had been out of radio contact with Moscow for days, and its crew did not know whether nuclear war had already begun. The submarine carried a nuclear torpedo, and the protocol for its use required authorization from 3 officers: the captain, the political officer, and the executive officer. The captain, Valentin Savitsky, was in a state of extreme stress and, according to accounts provided later by crew members, believed he might be witnessing the opening of a war. He reportedly stated that if they were going to be destroyed anyway, they might as well fire. The political officer, Ivan Maslenikov, agreed. The executive officer, Vasily Arkhipov, did not. Arkhipov refused to authorize the torpedo launch. He argued, persuaded, held the position. The torpedo was not fired. Arkhipov was not a heroic figure in any dramatic sense. He was an administrator, a bureaucrat of military authority who happened to be in the right place at the right time and happened to read the situation correctly. He died in 1998. The incident remained largely unknown until documents began to be declassified in the early 2000s. The nuclear weapons program of the United States, during the early Cold War decades, operated under safety standards that would be considered catastrophic by any later measure. Between 1950 and 1980, the United States acknowledged a series of incidents involving nuclear weapons that it classified under the term broken arrow, which was the official designation for accidents involving nuclear weapons that did not result in nuclear detonation. There were, by official count, 32 such incidents. The actual number, based on research by journalists and historians working from partially declassified records, appears to be higher. These incidents included aircraft crashes, dropped weapons, fires on submarines, collisions at sea, and at least one case in which a nuclear weapon was simply lost and never recovered. In 1968, a B-52 carrying 4 hydrogen bombs crashed on sea ice near Thule Air Base in Greenland. The conventional explosives in the weapons detonated on impact, scattering plutonium across a wide area. The cleanup operation, conducted under classified protocols, involved hundreds of workers who were not fully informed of what they were handling. Many of them subsequently developed cancers at rates that researchers later determined were statistically anomalous. The Danish government, on whose territory the incident occurred, had not been informed that American aircraft were routinely flying over Greenland with nuclear weapons. The arrangement was covered by a classified agreement that conflicted with public Danish nuclear policy. Denmark had declared itself nuclear-free. The agreement allowing American nuclear overflights of Greenland remained secret for decades. In 1966, a B-52 collided with a refueling tanker over the coast of Spain near the town of Palomares. 4 hydrogen bombs fell to Earth. 3 were recovered on land, though 2 of them had their conventional explosives detonate on impact, scattering plutonium across Spanish farmland. The 4th bomb fell into the Mediterranean Sea and took nearly 3 months to locate and recover. The cleanup of the contaminated farmland in Palomares was never fully completed. In 2015, the United States and Spain signed an agreement to address the remaining contamination, which meant that radioactive soil from an American military accident in 1966 was still sitting in Spain nearly 50 years later. The local population had been told very little about the nature of what had landed on their land. The Soviet Union had its own equivalent record. The K-19 submarine, which suffered a catastrophic reactor coolant failure in 1961, resulted in crew members being exposed to lethal doses of radiation while attempting emergency repairs in the reactor compartment. 8 died within weeks of the accident. Others died in the years following from radiation-related illness. The submarine was sometimes referred to by its crew as Hiroshima. The incident remained classified in the Soviet Union until decades after it occurred. The K-129, a Soviet submarine, sank in the Pacific Ocean in 1968 under circumstances that have never been fully explained publicly. The CIA, through a project called Azorian and using a specially constructed deep-sea salvage vessel called the Glomar Explorer, conducted a covert operation to recover part of the wreck from a depth of approximately 16,000 feet. The operation partially succeeded, recovering a portion of the submarine along with, according to various accounts, material including nuclear-armed torpedoes. The full account of what was recovered and what was done with it remains classified. When journalists attempted to report on the project in 1975, the CIA requested and initially obtained a news blackout. When the story was published anyway, the government declined to confirm or deny most of the specifics. The concept of mutually assured destruction, which is the strategic doctrine that underpinned most of the Cold War's deterrence architecture, rested on the assumption that both sides would behave rationally under pressure. Rational, in this context, meant that decision-makers on both sides would calculate that initiating a nuclear exchange would result in their own destruction, and would therefore be deterred from initiating one. The doctrine was constructed largely by civilian strategists, many of them associated with institutions like the RAND Corporation, working with mathematical models of conflict and decision-making. What those models did not, and could not fully account for, was the way actual institutions and actual human beings behave when the models become operational reality. There was a period in the late 1950s and early 1960s when the United States military maintained war plans under a construct called the Single Integrated Operational Plan, the SIOP, which was essentially the master script for American nuclear warfare. The first version of this plan, SIOP 62, called for the delivery of all American nuclear weapons at essentially the same time against all targets in the Soviet Union, China, and other communist states in a single massive strike. The targets included military facilities, industrial centers, and cities. The estimated casualties were in the hundreds of millions. The plan allowed for no graduated response, no limited options, no proportionality. It was an all-or-nothing document. When civilian officials, including Kennedy administration figures who reviewed it in 1961, were briefed on its contents, several of them were visibly shaken. One official described leaving the briefing room and needing to take a walk outside. The plan was eventually modified to include more options, but the underlying logic of massive coordinated employment persisted for years. The incident, sometimes called the Soviet nuclear false alarm of 1983, and Petrov's decision represent one category of near-miss, sensor error. There is another category that is in some ways more disturbing, which is near-miss through human miscommunication inside systems that were supposed to be reliable. In 1979, a training tape simulating a Soviet nuclear attack was accidentally inserted into the operational computer system at the North American Aerospace Defense Command. For a period of several minutes, personnel at NORAD were receiving indications of a large-scale Soviet missile launch. Interceptor aircraft were brought to a state of alert readiness. A National Emergency Airborne Command Post, the aircraft designed to serve as a flying command center in the event of nuclear war, was ordered to take off. The error was identified before any further action was taken. An investigation afterward revealed that the safeguard that was supposed to prevent training data from being processed as operational data had failed. The following year, in 1980, a similar incident occurred when a faulty integrated circuit worth 46 cents caused NORAD computers to report, again, an incoming Soviet missile attack. Again, forces were elevated to alert status. Again, the error was caught. Both incidents were subsequently described in congressional testimony. The full classified record of how many similar incidents occurred between NORAD's founding and that period has never been made fully public. The relationship between nuclear weapons policy and actual operational command was, throughout the Cold War, characterized by a gap that neither side was fully able to close. The policy, as articulated by civilian leaders and presented to the public, described a tightly controlled system in which the authority to use nuclear weapons was carefully managed, and any use would represent a deliberate decision by responsible civilian authority. The operational reality, as documented in the records that have since been released, was substantially more complicated. There were periods when American nuclear weapons were positioned at overseas locations without adequate security, when the local commanders had access to weapons that they could, under certain interpretations of their orders, have employed without direct authorization from Washington, and when the communication systems that were supposed to link those commanders to Washington were unreliable enough that the gap between policy and practice was significant. During the 1950s, American nuclear weapons stored in Europe were housed under security arrangements that, by later standards, appear inadequate. The weapons were at various points stored in ways that made them vulnerable to seizure, and the procedural controls over their use were less formalized than the public presentation of American nuclear policy suggested. The Soviet Union's weapons program had its own structural peculiarities. The Soviet leadership, deeply distrustful of its own military after the purges of the 1930s, constructed a system in which the actual technical components necessary to arm nuclear weapons were controlled separately from the weapons themselves. The physical security arrangements for Soviet nuclear weapons, particularly in the early decades, were in some respects even more vulnerable than American arrangements. There have been accounts, drawn from post-Soviet Russian sources, of incidents in which Soviet nuclear weapons were stored in conditions that were, by any reasonable assessment, unsafe. The full record of Soviet nuclear accidents remains substantially less documented than the American record, partly because the Soviet archives have been opened far less completely, and partly because the institutional culture of secrecy in Russia has persisted in forms that mean the Cold War nuclear record there will likely never be as fully reconstructed as its American equivalent. The British nuclear weapons program, which developed in parallel with the American and Soviet programs, operated under constraints that were not publicly acknowledged for decades. For a significant period in the 1960s, British nuclear warheads were secured not by sophisticated electronic locks or permissive action links, but by a bicycle lock. This is not an approximation or a dramatic simplification. The physical security device on certain British nuclear weapons was literally a bicycle lock of the kind available in any hardware store. The reasoning behind this arrangement was, within its own logic, coherent. The British military's concern was not that someone would steal and misuse the weapons. The concern was that a nuclear strike might damage or destroy the electronic systems on the weapons, rendering them unusable. A mechanical lock would survive conditions that would destroy electronic systems. The solution to one problem created a different one, which is that the physical security against unauthorized use was essentially non-existent. This information became publicly known through the work of journalists and researchers in the early 2000s, and was subsequently confirmed by official sources. It was not information the British government had volunteered. The concept of the nuclear football, the briefcase containing the communication equipment and authentication codes that allows the American president to authorize nuclear launches, is familiar enough that it has become a kind of cultural shorthand for presidential nuclear authority. What is less well known is that the actual operational history of the football includes a significant period during which the codes designed to prevent unauthorized launches were not actually in use. The president's authentication codes, the specific sequences that were supposed to verify that any launch order was coming from legitimate authority, were set to all zeros at Strategic Air Command for approximately 2 decades. Because the commander of Strategic Air Command during that period, General Curtis LeMay, believed that the requirements for authentication added delay to the response time, and that delay was operationally unacceptable. This meant that the system designed to ensure only the president could authorize nuclear launches was, for those 2 decades, bypassed. Any properly formatted launch order would have been executed. The arrangement was discovered and corrected, but the period during which it existed represents a structural gap between stated policy and operational reality of a kind that was not exceptional during the Cold War. It was, in various forms, the norm. The strategy of massive retaliation, which governed American nuclear policy through much of the Eisenhower administration, was publicly presented as a deterrent. Privately, it was something more specific and more disturbing. The documents that have since been declassified reveal that American war planning during the Eisenhower years included serious work on options for preemptive nuclear strikes against the Soviet Union. The logic was that, during a window before the Soviets had developed sufficient capability to retaliate effectively against the American homeland, a first strike might be militarily achievable. The window would close as Soviet capabilities grew, and the doctrine shifted to accommodate that reality. But the fact that serious institutional planning for a preemptive nuclear first strike was conducted at the highest levels of the American military establishment is not a minor footnote. It is a structural feature of the Cold War that tends to be understated in the history that was taught for decades in American schools. The nuclear testing programs of both superpowers had consequences that were documented internally and concealed publicly for years. The American atmospheric testing program, conducted primarily in Nevada and in the Pacific, exposed American military personnel, civilian observers, and populations living downwind of the Nevada test site to radiation levels that were known at the time to present health risks that were not fully disclosed to those being exposed. The soldiers who were marched toward the sites of nuclear detonations as part of training exercises were told the exposure was safe. The documents that emerged decades later made clear that the relationship between official safety declarations and internal safety assessments was not close. The populations of the Marshall Islands, where the United States conducted dozens of nuclear tests, including the Castle Bravo test of 1954, which yielded 2.5 times its intended yield and contaminated a vast area of the Pacific, were relocated from their home islands and told the relocation was temporary. They were not fully returned. The contamination in certain areas of the Marshall Islands, based on testing conducted decades after the Cold War ended, remains at levels that preclude safe habitation. The populations of these islands were, in effect, administered out of their homes as a cost of the nuclear program. The compensation and acknowledgement processes that followed were partial, delayed, and contested. The Soviet testing program at Semipalatinsk in Kazakhstan exposed the population of the surrounding region to radiation from over 400 nuclear tests conducted between 1949 and 1989. The Soviet population in the area was not meaningfully warned or protected. The health consequences for the population, documented by researchers after the Soviet Union's dissolution, were severe. Cancer rates, birth defects, and other radiation-related health conditions in the region were, and remain, statistically anomalous. The full documentation of what the Soviet government knew about these consequences, and what it chose not to tell the affected population, has only been partially assembled. The record exists, distributed across archives that are not fully accessible, in the testimony of people who lived through the testing period, and in the epidemiological data that researchers have spent years compiling. The Soviet state's management of this information represents a scale of administrative concealment that is difficult to absorb as a simple factual statement. The mechanisms of nuclear command and control on both sides were built around the assumption that communication would function under nuclear attack. Both sides devoted enormous resources to hardened communication systems, airborne command posts, submarine communication relays, and redundant networks designed to ensure that orders could be transmitted even after a first strike. The gap between the designed capability and the operational reality was never fully closed. Communication systems that were theoretically capable of surviving nuclear attack were in practice dependent on infrastructure that was vulnerable in ways that were not always acknowledged. The American military's reliance on commercial telecommunications infrastructure for certain aspects of its command and control was a structural vulnerability that persisted throughout much of the Cold War. The Soviets had similar dependencies. The systems that were supposed to ensure rational, deliberate control over nuclear weapons in the event of a crisis were, in the worst-case scenarios they were designed for, less reliable than the public presentation suggested. Project Artichoke, Project MKultra, and the related programs conducted by the CIA during the Cold War represent a dimension of the conflict that is categorically different from the nuclear dimension, but equally revealing of how institutions behave when operating under conditions of existential fear without meaningful oversight. MKultra was formally authorized in 1953 and involved experiments on human subjects, many of them without the subject's knowledge or consent, testing the effects of psychedelic drugs, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, psychological manipulation, and other techniques on human behavior and cognition. The program's goal was to develop methods of behavior control that could be used against Soviet operatives or to resist Soviet attempts at the same. The subjects of the experiments included CIA personnel, military personnel, prisoners, psychiatric patients, and civilians who were given substances without their knowledge in settings that included bars, restaurants, and hospitals. At least one American civilian, Frank Olson, died in circumstances that were officially attributed to suicide and were later the subject of sustained and credible challenge. The program was officially terminated in 1973. The director of the CIA at the time ordered the destruction of program files. Many files were destroyed, some were not, and were discovered in 1977 during an unrelated filing review. The subsequent congressional hearings provided a partial account of the program. The full scope of what was done, and to how many people it was done, was never established, because so much of the record was destroyed. The intelligence community's management of information about Soviet capabilities during the Cold War was characterized by a systematic tendency toward overestimation that had direct policy consequences. The missile gap, the concept that dominated American strategic thinking in the late 1950s and became a significant element of the 1960 presidential campaign, was based on intelligence assessments that overstated Soviet missile capabilities. The actual number of Soviet intercontinental ballistic missiles in the early 1960s was far smaller than the American intelligence estimates had suggested. The overestimation was not random error. It reflected institutional pressures, methodological limitations, and in some cases deliberate choices about how to present ambiguous data. The consequence was that American defense spending, force posture, and diplomatic behavior were all calibrated against a threat that was, in certain specific and measurable respects, larger on paper than it was in reality. The Team B exercise of 1976, in which a group of outside analysts were given access to the same intelligence used by the CIA's own analysts and produced a dramatically more alarming assessment of Soviet capabilities and intentions, was later revealed to have significantly overstated the threat in ways that influenced policy for years. The B team's assessment became a template for the argument that the CIA's institutional approach to Soviet threat assessment was systematically too complacent, an argument that shaped American defense and intelligence policy through the end of the Cold War and beyond. The Soviet side had its own intelligence failures and deliberate distortions, operating in an environment where reporting bad news to superiors carried personal risk. The Soviet intelligence apparatus produced assessments that reflected what the institutional hierarchy wanted to hear as much as what the data supported. The result was that both sides were making strategic decisions based on pictures of the adversary that were distorted in different ways and for different reasons, and that neither side had a reliable mechanism for correcting those distortions in real time. The Berlin crises of 1948 and 1961 are typically characterized as moments of high tension that were managed through a combination of resolve and negotiation. The 1961 crisis, which resulted in the construction of the Berlin Wall, had an operational dimension that is less often discussed. When Soviet and American tanks faced each other at Checkpoint Charlie in October 1961, with their main guns pointed at each other and their crews on full alert, the confrontation lasted approximately 16 hours before both sides withdrew simultaneously. What is documented, but less prominently remembered, is that at least some of the American tanks at Checkpoint Charlie had their main guns loaded, and that the rules of engagement under which they were operating were not fully specified for the specific situation they were in. The officers on both sides were making judgments about what their orders permitted and required in a situation for which no precise operational guidance had been issued. The confrontation ended because both sides chose to withdraw. There is no document that makes clear what would have happened if either side had chosen differently. The American policy of extended deterrence, which was the commitment to use nuclear weapons to defend American allies in Europe and elsewhere, required that American allies believe the commitment was credible. It also required the Soviet Union to believe it. Maintaining that credibility involved a continuing performance of resolve that had its own costs and risks. The deployment of American nuclear weapons in European countries, some of which had populations and governments that were ambivalent about hosting them, created security challenges and political complications that were managed through a combination of classified agreements, public reassurances, and institutional arrangements that were not fully transparent to the democratic publics of the countries involved. The number of American nuclear weapons deployed in Europe at the peak of the Cold War was in the thousands. They were deployed in forms ranging from artillery shells to gravity bombs to surface-to-surface missiles. The custodial arrangements for these weapons, the agreements governing the conditions under which they could be used, and the communication systems linking them to American command authority were classified at levels that meant the elected governments of some of the countries hosting them did not have full access to the details of the arrangements. The neutron bomb, technically called the enhanced radiation weapon, was developed in the United States in the 1970s and created a political controversy that revealed something important about how Cold War military policy was made and communicated. The weapon was designed to maximize the lethal radiation effect relative to the blast and heat effects, making it particularly effective against armored forces in a way that would, in theory, limit collateral damage to infrastructure. The political problem was that describing the weapon, honestly, as a device designed to kill people while leaving buildings standing was extremely difficult to reconcile with the public rationale for NATO's nuclear posture, which emphasized deterrence rather than actual employment. The controversy over whether to produce and deploy the weapon created a significant rupture between the Carter administration and its European allies, and ultimately resulted in the decision not to deploy. The episode illustrated how the gap between military logic and political communication about that military logic was a structural feature of Cold War defense policy. The role of the nuclear submarine in Cold War strategy was, for most of the Cold War's duration, largely invisible to the publics of both sides. The submarine-launched ballistic missile was, from the perspective of deterrence planners, the most survivable element of the nuclear triad, because a submarine at sea was essentially impossible to locate and destroy in a preemptive first strike. This survivability made it the most credible element of the deterrent. It also meant that the submarines and their crews operated with a degree of autonomy that was structurally necessary and institutionally managed with considerable care. The procedures for authorizing nuclear weapons use on American submarines involved elaborate authentication protocols and required multiple officers to agree before a launch could proceed. The classified record of how those procedures worked in practice, including the degree to which communication between submarines and command authority was reliable under realistic wartime conditions, has never been fully made public. What is known is that submarines regularly operated for extended periods without the ability to receive or transmit communications in the normal sense, and that the protocols for operating under those conditions were designed to balance deterrent credibility with the prevention of unauthorized use in ways that involved trade-offs that were not publicly discussed. Soviet submarines had their own operational history that intersected with the near-miss record of the Cold War. The Yankee-class submarine K-2-19, operating in the Atlantic in October 1986, suffered an explosion in one of its missile tubes that resulted in a fire and the eventual sinking of the vessel. During the crisis on board the submarine, there was a period during which the condition of the nuclear missiles in the damaged section was unknown to the crew managing the emergency. A sailor named Sergei Preminin entered the reactor compartment to manually shut down the reactors and prevent a runaway nuclear reaction. He succeeded in shutting down the reactor, but was unable to open the hatch to exit the compartment afterward. He died in the compartment. The K-2-19 sank. The nuclear missiles on board remain on the ocean floor. The Soviet government's public reporting of the incident understated its severity. The full account of what happened and what the consequences could have been was not publicly available until years after the Soviet Union's dissolution. The relationship between Cold War strategy and the scientific and technical communities that sustained it was characterized by a degree of integration between civilian and military institutions that had no real precedent. The American weapons laboratories at Los Alamos and Livermore, the think tanks like RAND and the Hudson Institute, the universities that trained the physicists and engineers who designed the weapons and the missiles, were all embedded in a system of classified contracts and clearances that created an institutional culture with its own internal logic and its own relationship to the broader civilian society. The people who designed nuclear weapons, who modeled nuclear exchanges, who calculated throw weights and circular error probabilities and megaton yields, were in many cases the same people who published in academic journals, taught graduate students, and participated in public policy debates. The knowledge they carried, the classified knowledge of how the weapons actually worked and what they would actually do, was permanently separated from the public language in which nuclear policy was discussed. The public debate about nuclear weapons took place in terms that were, by design, several layers removed from the operational reality that the people who managed the weapons actually worked with. The medical and public health consequences of nuclear testing and nuclear weapons production were known to the relevant authorities significantly earlier than they were acknowledged to the public. The relationship between radiation exposure and cancer, between plutonium contamination and long-term health effects, between the products of nuclear fallout and the health of populations living downwind of test sites, was studied and documented by scientists working within the weapons programs before that information was made available to the populations it most directly affected. The decision to withhold that information was not made once by a single authority, in a single moment. It was made repeatedly by multiple authorities over multiple decades through a combination of formal classification decisions, institutional risk assessments that weighed disclosure against strategic and political costs, and bureaucratic inertia. The result was that populations in the United States, in the Soviet Union, in the Pacific, in Kazakhstan, in Australia, and in other places where nuclear testing was conducted, were exposed to health risks about which they were not fully informed, and that the mechanisms of accountability for those exposures have been, in most cases, partial, delayed, and contested. The arms control process that was conducted throughout the Cold War, beginning with the Limited Test Ban Treaty of 1963 and continuing through the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks and the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaties, was publicly presented as a process of rational management of the nuclear danger through negotiated limits on weapons. The record of those negotiations, including the classified negotiating records that have since been partially released, reveals a process that was simultaneously rational in its procedural form and deeply constrained in its substantive reach. The weapons limits that were negotiated were, in most cases, set above the levels that either side actually needed for deterrence, which meant the constraints were real in legal and political terms, but less significant in strategic terms. The verification mechanisms that were negotiated were, until the later treaties, limited in ways that meant both sides operated with significant uncertainty about whether the other was complying. The intelligence resources devoted to monitoring compliance with arms control agreements were vast. The conclusions those resources produced were, in some cases, contested within the intelligence community for years. The arms control process created a set of institutions and procedures that represented genuine international cooperation under conditions of mutual hostility. It also created a framework for managing the nuclear competition that was more successful at legitimizing the competition than at ending it. The civil defense programs that both sides maintained throughout the Cold War represented perhaps the most visible administrative expression of the assumption that nuclear war might actually happen and that populations needed to be prepared for it. In the United States, the civil defense apparatus, which involved fallout shelter programs, public education campaigns, and the elaborate system of continuity of government that included the evacuation plans for political and military leadership and the construction of hardened underground facilities, was publicly presented as protection for the civilian population. The classified record makes clear that the civil defense planners had a considerably more realistic assessment of what nuclear war would actually mean for civilian populations. Studies conducted within the government during the 1960s and 1970s, using casualty estimates based on actual weapons yields and targeting plans, produced numbers that were, by any human measure, incomprehensible. The estimates varied based on assumptions, but they consistently showed casualties in the tens of millions in the early stages of a nuclear exchange, with indirect consequences from infrastructure destruction, disease, and agricultural failure that would extend the death toll far beyond the initial military effects. These estimates were produced by the same government that was simultaneously telling the public that a well-stocked fallout shelter and a basic knowledge of radiation exposure could significantly improve survival chances. The relationship between the classified reality and the public program was not accidental. It was a managed gap, maintained because the alternative, which was telling the public that in the event of nuclear war, the government's primary concern was its own continuity rather than civilian survival, was not compatible with maintaining political support for the deterrence posture that was supposed to prevent the war from happening. The Soviet civil defense program, Gражданская оборона, was considerably more extensive than its American equivalent in terms of the physical infrastructure it created and the degree to which it was integrated into ordinary Soviet institutional life. Soviet citizens were regularly trained in civil defense procedures. Subway systems in major Soviet cities were designed with nuclear survival functions in mind. The elite bunker systems constructed for the Soviet leadership were, by the accounts that have become available since the Cold War, far more extensive than their American equivalents. The Metro II system, a series of deep underground tunnels beneath Moscow, was widely reported to exist throughout the Cold War and has been partially confirmed by post-Soviet accounts and satellite imagery. The existence of elaborate survival infrastructure for the leadership, alongside civil defense programs that were publicly presented as providing meaningful protection to the general population, represented the same structural gap between classified reality and public communication that characterized the American program. The populations of both superpowers were, throughout the Cold War, managed in their relationship to the nuclear danger through information programs that were calibrated to maintain social order rather than to provide accurate assessments of the actual risk. The post-Cold War period produced a series of revelations about the Soviet nuclear weapons program that had not been available during the conflict itself. Among the most consequential was the disclosure, through the work of researchers and defectors in the 1990s and early 2000s, that the Soviet Union had maintained a biological weapons program of a scale and ambition that far exceeded what Western intelligence had estimated during the Cold War. The program, centered on an organization called Biopreparat, had employed tens of thousands of scientists and technicians working on the development, production, and weaponization of biological agents including plague, smallpox, anthrax, and engineered pathogens that had no natural counterpart. The program continued for years after the Soviet Union signed the Biological Weapons Convention in 1972, which prohibits the development and stockpiling of biological weapons. The Soviet government signed the convention, continued the program, and maintained the public position that it was in compliance. Ken Alibek, who had been a senior official in the program and defected to the United States in 1992, provided the most detailed public account of what the program had actually involved. The scale of what he described was large enough that American officials who were briefed on it after his defection found it difficult to fully absorb. The biological weapons program represented a dimension of Cold War military competition that had proceeded almost entirely outside the public understanding of the conflict, and its existence called into question the reliability of the arms control verification mechanisms that both sides had publicly presented as meaningful constraints on the competition. The transition from Cold War to what came after was, in institutional terms, less of a transformation than the political language of the period suggested. The Soviet Union dissolved in December 1991. The nuclear weapons that it had accumulated over decades did not dissolve with it. They were distributed across multiple successor states, including Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan. The process of consolidating those weapons, securing them under the authority of the Russian Federation, and ensuring that they remained under reliable command and control, was conducted under conditions of significant institutional stress, during a period when the Russian state itself was in the early stages of a reorganization whose outcome was not clear. The Nunn-Lugar Cooperative Threat Reduction Program, through which the United States provided resources and technical assistance to support the dismantlement and securing of Soviet-era weapons, addressed a real problem with real resources. The scope of the problem it was addressing was, in some respects, larger than the public account of the program conveyed. There were periods in the early 1990s when the security of Soviet-era nuclear materials was, by the assessments of people working directly on the problem, genuinely uncertain. The full classified record of what was found, what was secured, and what the actual risk was during that transition period has not been made public. The infrastructure of nuclear deterrence that was built during the Cold War did not end when the Cold War ended. The weapons remained. The delivery systems remained. The command and control systems remained. The targeting plans were revised, but their structure persisted. The institutional arrangements that had been built around the management of nuclear weapons, the bureaucracies, the clearance systems, the classification structures, the research programs, the production facilities, the surveillance and verification architectures, all of these things continued to function after 1991, adapted to the new political context, but not fundamentally reconstituted. The two countries that had built the largest nuclear arsenals retained those arsenals. They reduced them through a series of arms control agreements to levels that were still, in terms of their potential consequences, incomprehensibly large. A few hundred nuclear weapons used in a major exchange between two nuclear powers would be sufficient to cause consequences for the global climate and food supply that would extend far beyond the direct targets. This was not a Cold War calculation. It is a present one, produced by research that has continued to refine the estimate of what nuclear conflict would actually mean for the systems that sustain human civilization. The systems that were built to manage the nuclear competition during the Cold War were not designed to be temporary. They were designed to be reliable. Reliability, in the context of weapons systems, means persistence. The early warning satellites remain in orbit. The command and control infrastructure remains underground and airborne and at sea. The submarines remain on patrol. The missiles remain in their silos. The authentication codes remain current. The targeting plans remain in force. The perimeter system or its successor remains operational. The nuclear football travels with the president. The procedures that would govern the use of nuclear weapons, refined over decades of institutional experience with near misses and false alarms and communication failures and command authority disputes, remain the operative procedures. The Cold War ended. The architecture it produced is still standing. What changed in 1991 was the political relationship between the states that held the largest nuclear arsenals. What did not change was the existence of those arsenals, the systems governing their use, or the fundamental strategic logic of deterrence that had required their construction in the first place. The verification regime that was supposed to provide confidence that the competition was being managed remains incomplete in ways that matter. The communication channels between nuclear-armed states remain less reliable under stress than the theories of deterrence require. The automated systems that were built to remove human judgment from the most time-critical decisions remain in place. The accidents, miscalculations, false alarms, and near misses that characterized the Cold War decades did not end because the political arrangement that defined the conflict changed. The conditions that produced them are structural, not historical. The Cold War is recorded as having ended. The systems it built to manage the permanent possibility of extinction are still running.